The title of this From Catholicism to Protestantism and Back, Biblical Motifs in Brno Stove Tile, Production in the Middle Ages and the Early Modern Period. The comfort of living in medieval castles was indirectly affected by climatic conditions, which in our latitudes are manifested by a climate referred to as temperate, in which warm summers alternate with cold winters. Longer-term changes in climatic conditions in the period observed are rhythmized by four defined stages, where longer, colder periods alternated with shorter, more favorable phases. However, the changes were not such of a nature that they could eliminate the need for winter heating of living rooms. The unfavorable cold seasons, influenced by the current weather, gave rise to the search for a suitable form of heating for residential interiors that were mostly built of stone. A dramatic change in the high medieval housing culture was thus brought about by tiled stoves, whose relief decoration was not purely decorative and the choice of themes was not random. Individual motifs were combined into a semantic whole, communicating the moral lessons of the time in a visual form. The main role was played by the dominant Christian symbolism in various forms, accompanied by heraldic reliefs, which are to a small extent supported by the other additional themes. In the late Middle Ages and early modern period, the royal town of Brno became a natural local center for the production of stove tiles. The craftsmen in Brno supplied tiles not only to burgher households, but also to heat the manorial castle of Spielberg. Of the many presumed pottery workshops, archaeological research has so far documented two, which were demonstrably also engaged in the production of tiles. Both were surprisingly located within the inner urban area. They were probably active during the last quarter of the 15th century, with an overlap into the beginning of the following century. According to micropetrographic analysis, the oldest relief-decorated tiles in Brno, which are known mainly from archaeological finds from Spielberg, also came from Brno workshops that were, however, not located in more detail. The concept of the Spielberg stoves of the second half of the 14th century consisted of heraldic decoration and symbolism of biblical events and moral principles. The resurrection is depicted in the form of a lion reviving dead calves with its breath. The good in the form of a griffin, a mythical creature combining the power of a lion and an eagle, as rulers over heaven and earth, faces the evil of a poisonous basilisk incarnated in a rooster with a snake's tail. The commissioners of the construction of at least two stoves, both unglazed and glazed in green and yellow, were the margraves of Moravia from the House of Luxembourg, most likely the younger brother of Charles IV, John Henry, who began to transform Spielberg into his residence castle after the middle of the 14th century. The griffin, this time in a pair, also made its way into the Spielberg tiled stoves of the first quarter of the 15th century and appeared in a new artistic rendition in the concept of so-called night stoves in the second half of the 15th century. Stoves with these griffins were also related to the residential function of the castle. The older one, only unglazed, is connected by the heraldry on other specimens with Sigismund of Luxembourg. The younger, white and gold night stove was probably installed at Spielberg as part of the modification of the manorial castle for the new ruler Ladislaus the Posthumous. In the last period of the 15th century, a stove also found its way to Spielberg, the dominant decorative motif of which is the adoration of the Magi seen from the New Testament, accompanied by a number of other related scenes, such as the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, Assumpta, San Wenceslas, or armigers, probably in the role of protectors of the depicted figures. The whole series, united by an identical late Gothic architectural framing, the fragments and torsos of the tiles of this series without traces of being used in a stove come from one of the above-mentioned Brno pottery workshops. The same assemblage of finds also includes unique torsos of two molds for the production of tiles of this series. Allegorical depictions of Christ include a running deer supported by the symbolism of the Holy Trinity in the form of a flowering plant. The first manifestations of the Renaissance in connection with the older Gothic artistic style are characterized by a pair of stone tiles depicting in circular medallions the motifs of Adam and Eve and the Tree of Knowledge, and the pelican feeding its young with its own blood, symbolizing Christ's bloody sacrifice for the redemption of mankind. Around the middle of the 16th century, a stove was built at Spielberg, the artistic concept of which is associated with the Reformation. This stove, with fixtures portraits of 12 biblical heroes, inspired by illustrations by the Nuremberg painter and engraver Georg Pench, accompanying the celebratory verses by the German poet Hans Sachs, became very popular in Brno. In European tile production, the figures are dominantly placed in Renaissance arc, but the author from Brno, in accordance with graphic models, placed them under the architrave. Although only fragments of the side pillars of the stove have been preserved at Spielberg, we know of a rich collection of 9 out of a total of 12 Old Testament heroes from Brno. We do not know who commissioned the installation of the stoves with motifs of biblical heroes at Spielberg, and therefore we are not sure whether their motivation indeed lay in their confession or just in their inclination towards the fashionable style of the time. However, we can demonstrably find a link between the Protestant environment and the Anabaptist tile production in the non-figural motif on intertwined hearts under the arcade, which are also combined in endless so-called mosaic or wallpaper patterns. During the second half of the 16th century, allegories returned to the stove decoration in a new concept. Among them were Christian virtues, faith, hope, and love, framed by richly decorated late Renaissance architecture. However, they apparently were not included in the concept of the Spielberg stoves due to the expected higher price. At that time, the castle was already administered by the city of came closer to the simple common standard of a burgher household, as is evident from the unglazed torso of a relief with the Old Testament scene of David and Bathsheba. Popular fashionable motifs in tile production were initially probably disseminated through relief positives, which then enabled to produce any number of negative forms in local workshops. The reason for moving the already finished high-quality molds to another workshop might have been the loss of relevance of the reliefs, which is usually put in connection with the change of the original commissioner of the stove's conceptual concept. Given the possibilities of transport at the time, the transport of finished tiles was used only for shorter distances, which is also documented in writing for the early modern period. Last but not least, so-called pirate copies were created in local workshops by imprinting available originals. Products from such molds can be easily detected thanks to the reduction of the resulting relief due to drying and firing. The remains of the tiles made with the same molds as the tiles from Spielberg have been documented in a number of mainly aristocratic residences. Micropetrographic analysis of these tiles, with one exception, prove local production, that is, the transport of positive variants of reliefs for the production of molds. The tiles from the oldest relief decorated stove from the second half of the 14th century are known from Orlik Castle near Humpolec. Tiles from stoves from the first quarter of the 15th century at the Boleradice Castle, about 35 kilometers away, were made in Brno. The so-called night stoves and tiles from the Adoration series appear in the original design, copies or imitations to a lesser extent in urban or ecclesiastical environments, but these stoves were most often used to heat castle interiors. The workshops in Brno supplied the manorial castle with tile goods, which they also offered to a local aristocratic and burgher households, and rather exceptionally to customers beyond the limits of the urban economic circle. An analysis of the assemblage of tiles from Spielberg Castle, in which we distinguish over 200 relief tiles, shows a slight percentage predominance of preserved religious motifs over the heraldic ones. A closer view reveals that the relief decoration of the medieval and early modern stove tiles presents biblical motifs in a form of symbolism that was standard for the given time and therefore fully comprehensible across the social spectrum. During the 15th century, it was gradually extended by realistically conceived scenes of biblical stories and characters. Among the most often depicted scenes were those associated with the birth and martyrdom of Christ from the New Testament and prophets from the Old Testament. The latter also appear in motifs that have been associated with Reformation influences. However, they played only an episodic role in the composition of stoves from Spielberg. The reason for the almost half representation of ornamental motifs, both vegetal and geometric, is the fashionable wave of more affordable mosaic wallpaper patterns of the early modern period, produced in Brno under the influence of high-quality Anabaptist goods from the South Moravian region. However, unlike some Brno palaces, Spielberg was supplied with only local, albeit well-crafted imitations. The highest quality Spielberg stoves can be considered the oldest ones, which the Margraves of Moravia from the House of Luxembourg had built to heat their residence in the second half of the 14th century. They were built in an unglazed but also a luxurious multicolored glazed design, and the ideological concept combines heraldic motifs with the symbolism of Jesus Christ. Thank you.